From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
Welcome to Take on the South, the podcast Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina. I'm Matt Simmons. I'll be your host today. I am very pleased today to be welcome Rash, author of, is 8 novels now?
Yeah.
8 novels, 3 books of poetry, and how many books of short stories?
7.
7. So man, that's quite a collection you got going on there. One of the great writers of the South, of Appalachia, of our day, of the late 20th and early 21st century. We are pleased to have him here with us at USC for our 2nd annual Neuffer Lecture in Southern Literature. Pleased you're going to be doing that for us tonight, and thank you for being so kind as to stop by here. So just want to talk with you today about your work, your background, and how you understand your place, how you understand this world that you write about. So first, Ron, why don't you just tell us about your background, where you're from, where you grew up, kind of, you and I were at lunch earlier talking about your family background and how that kind of plays into the work you do.
Right. Yeah, I think my family's story is not that unusual for a lot of Southerners, particularly families that, such as mine, that had a long history in the mountains, particularly of North Carolina. My family has been there since mid-1700s, Wilkes County, Buncombe, and Watauga County.
So all that northwest North Carolina.
Northwest North Carolina. But And this, I think this is an interesting aspect of not only Appalachia but the South, but how families move. A lot of families from Appalachia moved to Detroit to work in car factories, but they also moved into the cotton mills in the Piedmont of North Carolina, but also the Piedmont of South Carolina.
Yes.
And that was certainly true in my family. My parents, my father's family came down. They were from near Asheville, and they came down to work in the mills. They would go back up sometimes. They made that trip back and forth several times in their lives. And my mother's family was from off a farm near Watauga, in Watauga County, near Boone. But they came down. My parents ended up in a textile mill in Chester, South Carolina.
Okay.
That's where they met, and I was born in Chester. We lived there a few years, and then we went back to western North Carolina, where I was closer to my family, to the extended family, and grew up there in Boiling Springs, North Carolina. Okay. So that kind of trip, I think, gave me a sense of really the difference, and even between the Piedmont South and the Appalachian South.
Sure. One thing, I know that you went to Clemson for a master's degree. You teach at Western North Carolina now. You're kind of back and forth. It's almost as if, your whole life you've been kind of right over the border, going back and forth there, right?
Yeah.
So do you think of yourself then as a Carolinian, as a North Carolinian and South Carolinian? Is there slippage between there? Are there distinctions between those places?
I think there's some slippage, yes, definitely. But I think probably because of where my family, all my relatives are, and pretty much even now, I still think of Western North Carolina kind of as the epicenter for my experience. Yes. And I spent so much time, particularly on my grandmother's farm growing up.
In Watauga.
In Watauga County. So I think that is the area that I've probably primarily been interested in and has been the focus of most of my writing, though I have written about the textile mills.
Yes. When I've read your work, there's so much that's about, that corner of North Carolina up there, right? Now you have some, you have fiction set here in Columbia, South Carolina. And one thing that as I've read your work, that I've always been really interested to see is these places that I know that are familiar places sort of being presented in sort of a new way, right? And one thing I really enjoy what your fiction does is sort of challenging our notions of what this place of Carolina, of South is. I mean, for instance, you've written quite a bit about these southern places, especially the mountains, that remain loyal to the Union in the Civil War, and about some of those conflicts that are there, right? So where does that sort of that I think challenges a lot of our expectations about what South means. You even have a novel, World Made Straight, right?
Yeah, right.
Which is actually about the main character there. He finds out about his own family history, his own place, and the strangeness, the unfamiliarity of this place. So I'm wondering, where does that sort of interest come from? Is this just a sort of family history thing with your family growing up there in northwestern North Carolina, or do you want us to see and understand South as never a monolith, as never a monolith, but always a sort of place with many different voices, many different ways of understanding?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a lot of it. There is, though, a personal history. I have 2 photographs of my relatives in the Civil War, male relatives in in uniform, and they're both in Union uniforms.
Wow. Okay.
So I think that awareness of that certainly has played a role. But I love Eudora Welty. She's one of my favorite writers, and she says,
ain't she everybody? So she's fantastic.
Yeah. And she said, one place comprehended helps us understand all other places better. But I think a lot of that comprehension is really going into the depths of a place, into its contradictions, and I think that's kind of where we're going here to a degree, and just really trying to get a sense of sometimes that what we think we know about a place maybe is not all of it.
Yeah. The contradictions of a place. Is that what you said? Yeah. I think that's really good. I was teaching Catherine Ann Porter this morning, and in there's that whole thing in Old Mortality where Miranda's out there. She's kind of trying to. At the end, she's going to go off. She's not going to listen to the past. She's going to go find the truth for herself and all this. And Porter notes kindly, gently, but deeply ironically that how ignorant Miranda is. I mean, this is what the last line of that story is the word ignorance, right? That's the way it ends. This way in which what we think we know and what we think we can get outside of, sometimes we can't get outside of it, and we're caught in a web that's much, much messier. And I see that some in your fiction. You have these people there who. There are these dark secrets they're trying to, run away from, get away from. Novel like The Risen, right? Not to give anything away, but there's something that's behind there that these people are really kind of struggling with, and that these 2 brothers there that they can't really get away from, right? And the contradictions in what we want a place to be, what we want ourselves to be, and who we actually are, I think is a powerful, image, and that I really like what you're saying there, and having the fiction I've read of yours, the poetry I've read of yours. I'm like, this is really giving me a way to think about it now. Like it's an exploration of contradiction. Yeah. Why did you want to talk about contradiction then? How did this become something did you sort of stumble into it, or was this a conscientious choice to explore this part of the South?
Well, I think it was just, I think the awareness, particularly because I was so influenced by writers such as Faulkner and Welty, and a big part of and Flannery O'Connor. Those were writers who were hugely important to me when I was reading as a teenager and as I began to write, and I recognized a deep kinship with them, and I still do. And yet at the same time, I was so aware of the differences of their landscape, which tended to be more, either the Delta or maybe middle Georgia, kind of the flatter landscape, and then the sense of the landscape that I had growing up in the Appalachian foothills and spending so much time in the mountains. And that fascinated me, and that contradiction of being part of the South and yet at the same time knowing that the South that I was in still had its really immense differences in culture, in music, though the music, of course, bleeds over, food, but most of all geography and the geology, the landscape, and I've become pretty obsessed with the idea of how landscape affects us psychologically. Actually have a character in The World Made Straight say that that's landscape is destiny.
Yes.
And I think that to me is fascinating.
Yeah, I teaching a class this semester, and we began with this one of the more significant works of early 20th century Southern history, U.B. Phillips's Life and Labor in the Old South. And he begins with this wonderful line, let us consider the weather, right? That's how it begins. Yeah. And there is a way in which, landscape, climate does shape us. But I mean, sort of dig into that some then. Does the landscape, how do the mountains, so let's look at the world that you knew, that you know. Here you are a person of northwestern North Carolina ancestry, of that Appalachian ancestry. But your life experience, you're growing up is in a Piedmont sort of, not just a Piedmont South, but a Milltown South in Chester County and then in Bowling Springs, right?
Yeah. I think Bowling Springs, though, you are getting into the foothills.
Okay,
so,
you're trying to get over there. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so just look at, and then, but all the time he's sitting on your grandma's farm in Watauga County.
Yeah, right.
So how, even as a boy, when you were navigating, going through these different places, were you already cognizant of how the shape of the land, the Piedmont, the foothills, the mountains proper, was already predetermining and shaping how the people there engaged and understood who they were and how they fit into the rest of the world around them? Yeah,
I really did. And I mean, it was very interesting to me because I spent so much time with my grandmother, but I've also seen it in my parents. I think for people who grow up in mountain cultures, and I've been fortunate enough to, my books have done well, and I think I'm translating 17 languages now. So
17.
I get, sometimes I'll get an email or sometimes a letter from maybe somewhere in Czechoslovakia or the Alps, and just that sense that, and I've had readers in Europe come up to me and say, well, I'm from a mountain region, and I really sense that you have a sense of what makes people, what people feel in that. And I found two things primarily. One is, and I've seen this in my own family, an intense sense of the mountains can be very protective, almost like a womb, almost keeping us safe from, in many ways, embracing that place. And that in some ways, and I've noted with some of my relatives who were moved out of the mountains that they always wanted to be buried in the mountains. They always came back home to be buried, even if they'd been out of the mountains 40 or 50 years. But the other part of that is, and I've seen a real streak of fatalism in my ancestors. My grandmother was just classic at this, and I think that's interesting particularly because people who've lived in the mountains traditionally have to be near water sources, so they're not on mountaintops. They're in the lowlands, in the valleys, in the hollows. Yeah. And there's a sense of just being constantly reminded of your insignificance. You've got these mountains, but also something physiological, just the lack of sunlight. So if you're in a dark, I remember, my aunt and uncle's farm was in this really deep valley, and the sunlight, I mean, we would be there, and I mean, you were in the pretty much shadows, pretty much from about 10, anytime before 10 to 3. And we know what that does. That lack of sunlight can affect your mental health. And so those things I've really been interested in that and really kind of plumbed those. And I think in so much of my work, I'm seeing both characters who feel like they embrace that or they have to flee it.
Mm-hmm. You said that you've realized how insignificant you are against these massive things. Yeah. So I think about, I was telling you at lunch, I taught your novel, Saints of the River, last semester. And, there you are. It's the Tiger River in that novel, right? If I remember correctly? Or something.
Tomasa,
yeah. So you've got which and not, this isn't spoiling anything for anybody who ain't read it. You learn like the first opening pages. A tourist of this family from Minnesota, a tourist down to northwest South Carolina, and their adolescent daughter drowns, and the strength of the water is such that they can't just get her out, and so then it becomes this whole debate on what do we do, right? But the tension in that novel, you've got the traditional mountain people, the kind of fatalistic people, right? You've got the environmentalists, if I remember, and then you've got the developers, right? And then you also have just the grieving families from Minnesota, so I guess 4 groups of people there. So I guess then this is something that I'm really interested in as a Southerner, as a person from the small town South, as a person with myself also a 300-year history, family history in the South, and seeing all the changes that are going on here, good and bad. I feel like being from Appalachia, these are even more intensely felt. What happens when this development, all these new sort of ways, competition of who owns this space, right? And how the space that makes your ancestors, makes them fatalist, has this womb that protects them and that embraces them, and that will also be the place that they will always be buried, as you say. What happens then, and I guess some of your fiction is concerned with this, what happens when new people come in and begin to contest over the meaning of that space? How do we make sense of that? And then how many, especially in Appalachia where so many people are economically disadvantaged, how do they even survive? How do they navigate that world and space? Well,
that really is I think that's the complexity of that is certainly I think something that is in my work. I mean, and you don't want to sentimentalize the people. You don't want to demonize either side.
Sure,
I mean, that's but it really is a really complex situation that particularly because at least I know in my own experience of my family that most of the people in the area between Bull Rock and Boone where I was, where my grandparents' farm was, where my mom grew up, I could go down a 2-mile road and I was kin to probably half the people on that road. Now, I would say there are many more houses, but probably out of 100 people there, I would not know 2 of them. So, and I think that kind of quick change can be really tough. And I'm also fascinated, as in my novel One Foot in Eden, what happens when, for instance, and this actually happened in South Carolina, a mountain valley, Jocassee Valley was flooded, and you had several thousand people who were moved out of that valley. And what happens when someone who's lived in a place generations suddenly is uprooted, and the stories, particularly of the older people who had to be moved out, many of them died within a year. And I mean, they could never adjust. And I mean, that isn't, I mean, this happens worldwide. I mean, it's happening, I think, with the Yellow River in China. Okay. What happens to communities when you have this kind of abrupt shift?
Well, I mean, you know what you're saying happens worldwide. If you think of, like a great novel like My Antonia, you have this immigrant family comes over, and if I'm remembering properly, the father commits suicide, relatively early on, and they're, after they come to America. And I guess part of this is it's not Bohemia anymore, right?
Right.
Like so what are you talking about? These people, if this makes so much sense, Ron. I'm loving this right now. If the world we grew up in, if the landscape, the physical aspects of it shape us, what happens when we go away from it, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think of myself when I go back to my hometown, East North Carolina. There are things I live here in Columbia. I walk out my front door sometimes, especially in the summer, and I'll get a whiff, a certain smell, and it's a Proustian moment. It's like Marcel eating the cookie there. I'm suddenly back, 11 years old, grandma's backyard, like I'm there. But then one of the, and I think some of your work also speaks to this as well. Sometimes I go back to these places. I go back home. It ain't home no more.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so there's always this sense of perpetual sort of unbelonging.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, or being in abeyance. Yeah.
Yes,
Being
in abeyance. Yeah.
I think that's one of the most interesting aspects because it can happen also as far as education. Because my grandfather couldn't read or write, but my father dropped out of high school, but later became a teacher.
Okay.
And he told me
What did he teach?
He taught art.
Okay.
And late in his life, he said that he had never felt. He said, I've left the kind of culture that I knew. He was speaking more socioeconomic. But I'm not comfortable in this world that's more academic, and I think that sense of lostness for him. I mean, it was like he never felt like he belonged in either one, and that's really striking, I think. And I've sensed some of that. I grew up in the place I grew up in, Boiling Springs, very small town, and I knew at a time in my life that I probably couldn't live there. Sure. I felt like I was drawn somewhere else, but yet at the same time, there's a part of me that can't leave it, and I think that's those kind of contradictions are so much a part, I think, of what makes literature work because this statement's been attributed to many people, but that the role of the artist is to deepen the mystery. And I think that's kind of goes back into what we were talking about earlier, contradictions, the complexity of place.
Absolutely. Well, talking about not just being in abeyance, I really like that phrase. I'm curious about a few things. Why do you think it is? I mean, I sit here and I listen. You're this author who's got your works translated in 17 languages, you say. You've won all these awards. You've sold all these many books. You're known around the world. You were telling me at lunch you were in Ireland recently. You had your most famous novel, Serena, was made into a film. They filmed in the Czech Republic, all places in the world, right? Why they couldn't do it in Central North Carolina, I don't know, right? Because that's where the novel takes place. They even have longleaf pines in Prague. I don't know, But here you are, also this man who, like me, has never lost your accent, right? Right. Where have you ever felt pressures to kind of position yourself differently? Because I'm also thinking about how you'll have other great Southern writers, people like Thomas Wolfe, who can only write about Asheville when he goes elsewhere, right? You have even someone as conservative in many ways as Alan Tate is doing his best work when he's in Minnesota and New York, and you have Catherine Ann Porter writing from New York and Chicago, and then you have Faulkner writing there from Oxford. You have Eudora Welty writing from her childhood bedroom, essentially. So why do you think it is that some writers can write about home honestly while still remaining there, while others, to paraphrase Joyce, need to go away so they can, forge the unknown consciousness of the race on the smithy of their soul, right? So why do you think that tension is there?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Ireland and the South, because I think there's some amazing parallels about that question. Irish writer I love is Edna O'Brien, and she had to stay. She had to leave. She knew she had to leave Ireland, but Ireland has, there are writers who felt like they had to stay there. And but with Southern writers, it's really an interesting question because so many of them felt like they had to leave, but others felt like they had to stay. And I can see the strengths of both, but I decided pretty early on when I really got serious about writing, I knew I had to stay here. I had to touch it. I had to hear it. I wanted to be reminded of it. And I think, in a sense, my allegiance was more toward Welty and Faulkner. Sure. And O'Connor, not so much by choice. Her health kind of made her come back. Yes. But I felt like I needed to be here to write about it. But I have a really dear friend, Robert Morgan, who writes about the South about as well, and particularly Appalachia as well as any writer I know. And he's taught at Cornell. He taught at Cornell for about 40 years, and he felt like he needed to be away.
Well, I mentioned my hometown, Wyville, North Carolina,
Ammons,
and A.R. Ammons, also there at Cornell, and so I mentioned that because I asked you. My hometown shows up in your story, Burning Bright. Yeah. It's just here's the character who's the arsonist, by the way. You make true. He's the arsonist, right? Yeah. But I asked you at lunch. I said, well, how did you just look on a map of East North Carolina and just pick this one, you said it was because of A.R. Ammons. And he's similarly someone who, he doesn't really write about the South, except when he does, but he goes to Cornell and that's where he is. And, he writes this amazing long poem, Tape for the Turn of the Year.
Yeah,
right?
I know that
Which
poem,
is this wonderful sort of odyssey, but where Odysseus is already literally in Ithaca, right? Because of where Cornell is. But, there are these callbacks to back, New Hope, which is the part of Wyville, the outskirts of Wyville where he's from was New Hope. And it's kind of these callbacks to those kind of places, or his poem like Easter Morning, which is, I had to go away, but kind of just the sort of scraping of the painful surface right underneath there. I'm curious though. You said you had to stay. You were saying some stuff earlier about Appalachia and its formativeness, the landscape itself. So I guess, is that what you mean? Because if you're going to write about this place, you had to continue to be formed by it, and not formed by what would inevitably become an abstraction, a mythology of it from remove. Yeah. So did you have to still remain there to be able to investigate it more?
I think so, and just that connection to even my family, continuing relatives. I think that was important to me. Yeah, landscape, sound, and also to watch the changes because we've had how many New Souths now? yeah, 20 or 30, but there are changes, and to watch the transformation and to see new issues come into it. I mean, we see what's happening, for instance, with the drugs, with meth, and we see some of that. We see what you were talking about earlier. What happens to a society when there's a shift in people coming into the region? Sometimes that economic gap. Those are all interesting questions. So, but I just kind of wanted to keep my feet on the ground here. Yeah.
I know what you mean by that. When did you know you want to be a writer?
I did not know it early on, but I showed all the symptoms. I love to read, and I also was very comfortable, spent a lot of time by myself as a kid. Sure. And not in necessarily a negative way, but I just loved to go out in the woods. I loved to daydream. So I think those things were important. I was aware of Wolfe. I think one thing about growing up in the South is that you are aware of that great tradition of literature. You learn about that pretty early on, and I think that certainly was important. But, along with that, when I was about 15, I was always a precocious reader, and I found a copy of Crime and Punishment in the library. I just thought, well, that's an interesting title. So I actually started reading that book, and Dostoevsky continues to be one of the most important writers for me. Sure. His influence, but there's a scene about 50, 60 pages in there where Raskolnikov kills a pawnbroker, and I at that moment it was like, as I've said this before. It wasn't so much, I'd always entered a book before that. This book entered me.
Oh, yes.
And I just felt this almost out-of-body experience, that the intensity of it. I remember exactly where I was. I was actually making a D in biology in high school, and I was on the back row reading this, and I continued to just to think about the idea that I was reading splotches of ink on a page, and I was having this intense an experience from that. And I think people who love literature know exactly what I'm talking about.
And they can, most people I think can have that book they can think of as like that moment. It just took your breath away. Yeah. And it just knocks you. It feels like, what you were saying, how do these splotches of ink, take you and grab you by your soul like that.
Yeah. And I think, that was, so when I got into actually about my freshman year in college, I started saying, well, I want to see if I can do this. And I dabbled with it, became more and more serious about it, and really, as I got into my late 20s, made a real commitment to it.
Well, a couple more questions, Ron. So you're a poet as well. We've talked most about your fiction. How do you see the work of poetry? What does poetry allow you to do? What sort of work does poetry allow you to do that your fiction, either long form or short form, does not allow you to do?
I think what poetry does that I admire about it is that it can accomplish so much, and it really, I think, has a sense of enchantment, and I use the word seriously there, and part of it is rhythm and sound, the intensity of those things, and it really can, I think, take us into I think a Romanian philosopher I like a lot, Sharon, once said that some words fail less than others. And I think poetry, when it's really good, it's like the words are just going at whatever the load is. They're carrying that. But also song and sound. I actually used to kind of think of what is a poem to me? It's a net for catching sounds.
A net for catching sounds. That's a great definition.
But what that can do is if the sounds are in the right place, the rhythm, the stresses, it can really put us into that almost hypnotic state. I mean, that's why so much of, whether it was agricultural information, religious information, has been conveyed by poetry in traditional cultures.
Yes. Yeah. Oh man, a net for catching sounds, and it does arrest you. There's this thing that went around the internet here recently with it is. Who is it? It's not. It's Helen Mirren. Is it Helen Mirren? No, it's. My wife makes fun of me. I get Helen Mirren and Maggie Smith, and confused all the time. But I think it's Helen Mirren. She's on some British chat show, and they're just, she's been a Shakespearean actor and everything.
Yeah.
And so they ask the chat show host. She says, "So you're just like a Shakespeare jukebox. We can just call something up." And they ask her, "Hey, just give us a sonnet." She goes, "Okay." She takes a deep breath and she just lets it go. And it's that there's something about even if you did not speak English, something about the way the sounds are captured by the net of what Shakespeare did put that poem together, kind of just creates this moment of just like sheer shocking just beauty in that way, right?
Oh yeah.
So I think what you're saying there about the net for catching sounds, I mean, that's a fantastic definition for poetry. It is what it does.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, once again, that's kind of interesting because I think it ties into the fact that I grew up in the South or was influenced by Southern writers, because that writers writing fiction, novels, short stories, and poetry, that's not done very often. Yet Southern writers have had more Southern writers seem to have been interested in doing that. Robert Penn Warren's a great example of that. Wendell Berry, but Robert Morgan and Fred Chappell in North Carolina have done it, and that is interesting also. And maybe part of it may be some people might think of it because and very often Southern poetry does tend to be more narrative.
Yes.
So you could kind of maybe take some of that back to an oral tradition.
Yes.
But I find that very interesting. Because it tends to be unusual, and the idea that if you write novels, you can't write poetry, but obviously can. And there are people who, Joyce Carol Oates does it. She's not a Southern writer, but I was always kind of aware of that. I think maybe more with Robert Penn Warren, that he could do that so brilliantly.
Yes, he does. And you have, he has these long, sort of narrative poems that do all this kind of stuff. Yeah, fascinating. Well, Ron, I know you got a new book out, Caretaker. I want to give you a moment just kind of talk about what are you doing with that book and how does it relate to your previous work so far?
Yeah. Well, this one was actually, I think, in some ways a really important book because I'd always wanted to use the landscape of my grandparents' farm, the farm I've been talking about, setting for a novel. And I'd never been able to. And so this was the first time I felt like I'd found the story that fit there.
Fantastic.
And so that was wonderful. And also a story that actually I think says a lot about small towns and it takes place in the South. So actually I was thinking about what we have with the Murdochs.
Oh, yeah.
And this book kind of ties into that because a story I heard 40 years ago, and I think it was actually happened in South Carolina, a small town, a prominent family, the most prominent family. I don't know if they were mill owners or what they owned, but they had had their son, the scion of the family, had fallen in. He was about 19, fallen in love with a young 16-year-old girl who came from a very, what they considered beneath them as far as social class, and they forbade them to marry, and then they eloped.
Okay.
Still lived in the community. After that, he got conscripted into the war. Was over in Europe fighting, and the family had her killed.
Oh, goodness.
And told him that it was natural causes. And so there was this kind of secret in this community because some people realized what had really happened.
Yes, absolutely.
And in a way, what was a gift to me, that is not a gift for someone who would want to know all the details, but I never found out if he learned what happened. And so I thought, wow, I should be able to do something with that.
Absolutely.
So that was kind of the genesis. But as I got deeper into the book, or writing the book, that I realized that I really wanted to get also into the parents' head as well as the young couple. And so the novel is about how far these people are thinking about going, how far will they go, and some of the tension.
Wonderful. Rod Rash, thank you for joining us here on Taking the South today. And we are so glad to have you here for our Neuffer lecture this evening. And I've been absolutely loved talking to you. I could talk to you all day long.
Well,
thank you so much.
We have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.